Right, Doug, Susie, Tony, I think we should start. So just a very warm welcome, everyone, to this webinar, which is on the MTQ Mental Toughness License User Training and other developments as well. There'll be a few other things that our guest, Doug Strycharczyk, talks about. My name's Paul Lyons. I'm from Mental Toughness Partners, and I'm your co-host this evening, along with Dr. Susie Green, who's the founder and CEO of the Positivity Institute. And Susie's going to manage the questions and monitor the chat box. So if you've any comments that you want to make, please just get in the chat box and ask a question or make a comment.
Great. Well, hi,
Susie, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, I just wanted to say hi. There's a few familiar names, but a lot of new names too. So hi to everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Susie. So we'll be recording the session, and I think it'll be about an hour when we've had Doug's presentation and your questions as well. But if we get to the stage where we haven't answered your question, Susie and I will be very happy to answer those offline. Now, I refer on a regular basis to Doug Strycharczyk as being the rock star of mental toughness. And I do that for good reason, because as co-founder and CEO of AQR International, who are the developers of the MTQ framework, he knows more about the practical application of the framework than anyone else on the planet. So we're delighted to have Doug along on this webinar, all the way from Chester, North Wales. So Doug, welcome, and we're really looking forward to what you've got to say about the framework, the LUT, and also the other developments.
Well, thank you very much for that big build-up, Paul. Thank you, and welcome to everybody. I'm really pleased to be with everybody, and I'm looking forward to sharing the next 45 to 60 minutes with you, because this is an unusual or a slightly different webinar to the ones that I'm used to. I usually sit here and I tell people about mental toughness. We're talking today really about the development of mental toughness as a global concept. So we are going to be talking about, I'll just bear with me for a second whilst I get the slides up. We're going to be talking about the Licensed User Training Program, which has just been upgraded. And I need to introduce another of my colleagues that you can probably see. That's Tony Molyneux. And this upgraded Licensed User Training Program is largely Tony's project. So there may also be an opportunity for Tony to answer questions about this. But we had, about a year ago, we decided that we wanted to improve the training materials that are associated with the mental toughness concept. And there are several reasons for this. And in fact, the plan was to do something long before COVID arrived. But COVID-19 has provided an interesting kind of impetus for all of this. So let me just provide a little bit of context. What we've seen in the last 24 months is an exponential growth in the interest in the concept, in mental toughness, in the 4 C's concept, and especially the now emerged 8-factor version of the mental toughness concept. And we know this from I suppose, a fairly crude measure. We can look at the number of tests that are being used around the world. And of course, that's reflected in our turnover. Our financial year runs September 1 to August the 31st. And in 2019, we noticed that between September 1 and December the 31st, that's 4 months, just a third of a year, we had achieved almost as many tests being used and turnover as in the whole of the previous 12 months. So that's indicated to us that growth is running at somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times the previous year. And of course, we've experienced growth in the application of mental toughness every year since it was launched. This indicated to us that we'd finally made the big breakthrough. It was moving from being a niche product, from a niche concept, something that was interesting a few, to interesting a lot of people who were beginning to understand just how important a concept it was and how universal it was in its application. At the same time, what we began to notice is that we were getting lots and lots of questions about its application. We were getting questions about how does it relate to emotional intelligence? How does it relate to leadership? And although the mental toughness programs, the development programs that we had prior to now addressed that to some extent, it really didn't address it to sufficient depth for a lot of practitioners. And at the same time, what we've seen is now over 120 academic peer-reviewed research papers published, which have all added to our understanding of the mental toughness concept. And although some of them are pure research, in fact, most are applied research. So there's an awful lot of research now that evidences the relationship between mental toughness and decision-making and leadership, creativity, problem solving, team working, and so on. And again, the materials that had been offered before for licensed user training, to some extent, picked that up, but there was an awful lot more information around. And in fact, right at the moment, we know of between 10 and 20 more academic research papers all coming through, all with something interesting to add. So we took a decision that we needed to upgrade our mental toughness development programs, at least the content, but we also needed to build in the flexibility to introduce a CPD component. Because again, what we were finding is that people might have attended a program 5 years ago, but they hadn't really updated their information. They knew what they knew 5 years ago, but didn't know what was available to them right now. And so we began to develop a program that could be partly self-guided, partly available as an online offering, and partly available as a blended offering. In other words, try to be flexible in its the way it's offered to people, but also flexible in the way in which it operates for practitioners. Because it's in our interests that practitioners are as up-to-date as possible with everything that's coming through. And of course, with a very new concept that is kind of just breaking into the mainstream, and with a lot of information coming from a lot of people, including practitioners. We have an awful lot of practitioner case studies now which illustrate evidence-based practice. So all of this material and all of this stuff is coming together, and we need somehow to be able to channel it and get it back out to the world at large. So that was part of our plan. And then, of course, what happened in January and February is COVID-19 struck. And for a while, we were as affected as any other organisation. It didn't stop, but we certainly weren't selling as many tests as people were selling toilet rolls. And what we found was that organisations and individuals were obviously focused on other things than looking at mental toughness. And then around May, June, we began to see people returning in significant numbers. So much so that the month that we've just gone, August, is now, we've just looked at the data, our use or sales of tests are 50% higher than the equivalent period last year. So in essence, what we're beginning to see is that there is a return of interest in the mental toughness concept. But what we do know from those people who are expressing an interest and taking the materials on board is that a lot of that interest is related to the impact of COVID-19. How are people responding mentally to sustained stress, pressure, and challenge? And around the world, what we're beginning to see is a lot of interest in not just the questionnaire, but in a more complete solution. People want to know can I assess my mental toughness? And then what can I do about it? Because I'm really having a tough time dealing with what's happening around me. But interestingly, COVID-19 also presented us with an opportunity, because although it affected our business in February and reduced the amount of activity, what in fact it did was also enable us to have enough capacity internally to devote our attention to making sure we could create this new, much better licensed user training program. And so Tony and her colleagues began to devote all of their time to redesigning and developing the new licensed user training program. So that's providing a little bit of background, a little bit of context. But our interest in developing a licensed user training program probably goes a little bit more widely than that. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the slide to move on forward. As most of you will know, in 2002, when Peter Clough launched the mental toughness concept, at that time, we understood the 4 C's: control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. What we now know is that there are 8 factors which support those 4 C's. And those 8 factors, in a sense, have been a big breakthrough in our understanding of mental toughness. I mean, at one level, simply as a generator of information about individuals, it generates round about 60 times more information than the old mental toughness questionnaire, the MTQ-48. But there are other things that we've learned in the last 2 or 3 years that are important for practitioners. For instance, the focus on self-awareness. It's one thing to be able to assess somebody's mental toughness. It's another thing for that person to be self-aware about their own mental toughness, especially in terms of those 8 factors, and especially in terms of the consequences of some of those factors. But secondly, we also began to understand that to talk about mental toughness and mental sensitivity sometimes wasn't as terribly useful, because as we expanded our ability to assess mental toughness across those 8 factors, what we began to see is interesting patterns of scores. And we could see that you could have people who overall were mentally tough, but at the level of those factors, they were sometimes mentally tough and sometimes mentally sensitive. And the same was true for mental sensitivity. And those patterns would have particular consequences in particular settings. So although, 20 years ago, we might have speculated about the impact of mental toughness, we now need to understand that to a much deeper level. And I think that's what we've managed to capture in this program. It also helps practitioners to do a more particular job with their clients. In other words, to be able to treat their clients much more as an individual and look at their individual traits. And it's not just that each of those factors is important in its own right. What we've seen in the last 12 months is that the combinations of factors also have an implication. So there's a requirement to move the content of the mental toughness licensed user training program onto another level. And one of the things we've had to do is to introduce a lot more practical content. And one of the findings that we found from looking at the old mental toughness licensed user training programs is if there wasn't enough practice, people were often wary about applying it once they'd completed their training. So the more practice we can introduce into the program, the better. So the development of the 8-factor concept, version of the concept, has been also a contributory factor. So for practitioners, we found that there was a need to update the content and to ensure that there was a reliable understanding of the concept and its applications. And what I mean by that is, what we would sometimes find is we would train people and then we'd go back to them and we'd find that they were developing their own interpretations, which often weren't based on any reliable research or evidence-based practice, but they were linking it to other ideas, and I mean, very usefully sometimes finding insights, but sometimes finding insights that didn't really stand scrutiny. And so what we want to do is to make sure that there's enough content in there that tells people about the evidence behind the concept. And of course, what we want to do is also to be able to enable people to access this online, and that's largely a consequence of COVID-19. We found that face-to-face delivery has reduced significantly, except curiously in China. And in China, people appear to have gone back to face-to-face delivery in big numbers. But we want people to be able to access this online and in blended formats. And then, as I said before, we needed to enhance the practical content. And finally, to be able to introduce standards. Now, the programs have always had some form of quizzes or tests to check that people are understanding the concepts that are being provided to them. We're now introducing a slightly more rigorous application of this. So at the end of a program, people are now being required to go away and use the questionnaire. They're provided with copies of the questionnaire, and to come back with a short report to demonstrate that they have understood how to use the measure and that they have learned something from that experience. So we're beginning to introduce components that support the individual in their application. Now, one of the things we've also found was that, by and large, when somebody completed their training, unless they were working within a particular network, often they would go off and we would not really hear from them again, and we wouldn't know terribly much about what they were doing. What we now want to do is to engage with the practitioners worldwide to a much greater extent. So we will be creating a licensed user network, which enables practitioners to compete with each other. It provides a channel through which we can update everybody regularly. We do issue updates, but curiously, in a lot of cases where people have been trained and connected with us through, say, a company email address, when they leave that company, we've suddenly lost the connection. So again, we are introducing processes where we can keep connected to our licensed users much more effectively so that we can update them. And then providing or using this, or I suppose exploiting this as a channel for generating ideas and problem solving. In other words, as a channel for people to be able to give their feedback about their application of the concept, their experiences with the concept, their experiences with the measures, and to be able to feed that back to us or make that available to us. Because the reality is that the most recent developments of the mental toughness concept and the mental toughness questionnaire have been driven by feedback from practitioners. The development of the factors supporting challenge and commitment have come entirely from feedback from practitioners. So getting that kind of feedback is very, very important. And then we also want to be able to add another level, which is really adding some CPD benefits, is that we're talking about perhaps targeting delivering a webinar, perhaps quarterly, from leading academics, partners and practitioners to this community of licensed users worldwide. Again, to try and stimulate and improve engagement. And the idea is to make sure that in this kind of fast developing world, and we can see, where we sit, we can see that the understanding of mental toughness and its applications is just growing all the time. And so there's a CPD benefit, a continuous professional development benefit for everybody. But of course, a lot of the people who we work with also have a commercial interest. They want to be able to engage with clients to be able to use this. And the more information they have about the range of applications of the concept and the measure, the better. And so we wanted to make sure that once you're a practitioner, you're a licensed practitioner, you will be continually kept up to date as much as possible. We, of course, can do what we can do. We can't make practitioners stay in touch with us. And then there's a reference there to PhDs and masters, because that's the other thing that has begun to emerge in the last 2 years, but especially, I would say, this year, is the number of people, many of them who are practitioners, who now wish to have a master's program that involves the mental toughness concept, but we've got an awful lot of people now wishing to do PhDs in mental toughness, and particularly in some sort of connection with something, whether it's a cultural difference, or it's to do with well-being, or it's to do with coaching. In the last month, I have dealt with 3 inquiries which I've now been able to pass to Professor Peter Clough, and all 3 want to do a PhD on mental toughness. So all of this is building a groundswell of information and data about mental toughness and its application in a whole host of areas. And that also has to be fed back to everybody. So that's the background really to what would look like the impetus to upgrade the way we develop practitioners, what we call the Licensed User Training Program. But it's actually part of a slightly wider agenda. First thing is that when we speak to a lot of clients, and we do, the clients are now going past the phase of being interested in the questionnaire. They're fascinated by the questionnaire, everybody is, because it's providing an insight into something they've never been able to get an insight into before. It adds something to all the behavioural measures they've been using. But the question is now turning more to, well, I need a solution. I don't just need to be able to diagnose the challenge or the problem. I want a solution. So the other part of the agenda is we are also developing a mental toughness development program. And this is designed to be self-guided. It also is going to be capable of being operated in a blended format. In other words, supported by coaches, mentors, managers, or trainers. And it's also going to be capable of being run as a tutor-led program if needed. And behind that, we are going to be incorporating not only traditional materials that we know have an impact on individual and organizational mental toughness, but we're also developing some leading edge materials, particularly those which are app-based. And the reason for that is we need to be able to introduce some sort of measurement to the tools and techniques that we introduce to people. Now, a lot of tools and techniques that are introduced to people to help them to develop their mental toughness work, but we know that they don't work for all people, so we need to understand that a lot better. To be able to understand that, we need to introduce some measurement. Then a development which is a little bit further down the line is that we now have a lot of interest around the world, both from the academic community, from many of our partners, and very definitely from some practitioners about joining a think tank. So we are establishing an International Centre for Mental Toughness Research and Development. It'll probably be established in partnership with Dr. John Perry in Ireland. It'll become an applied think tank, and it'll be a forum where academics, practitioners, and ourselves will be able to join and to be able to share ideas and help us to identify trends, identify the most common questions that are being asked, so that we can direct applied research to try to solve the questions that are being asked. It's going to sit alongside Interact, which is an already existing think tank for mental toughness research. And that is based at Queen's University in Belfast and is already carrying out and has already published a lot of really valuable research. Their focus tends to be a little bit more on pure research, which is all very useful because it is capable of being examined and applied, but is often one step away from the practitioner. Well, the International Centre for Mental Toughness Research and Development will work in collaboration with Interact. Many of the people will be in both groups, but there'll be a greater focus on applied research in this think tank. Then finally, in about 12 months, and this is an idea from Professor Clough, is that we are going to look at setting up a journal and perhaps founding a journal through which people can publish their case studies, their research, because we already have a lot of practitioners, often who are doing a master's program, for instance, who are producing some remarkable research, but it can't find an easy home for publication. And we can do that. So again, there's an awful lot happening. The development of the licensed user training program is a key element to that, because irrespective of everything else we're doing, if you can't assess mental toughness reliably, you can't do much of the rest of the stuff. So the development of the new licensed user training program is a very, very important foundation block for everything else to happen. We really believe, and I think people are beginning to understand it, is that the mental toughness concept is probably one of the most important concepts that's arrived in the world of people and organisational development in the last 20 years. And it has one big, big advantage. It can make a big contribution to something else that's very important to us, and that lies underneath some of these developments, and that's evidence-based practice. We can actually make a difference. We can move away from the kind of casual evidence that people will often use to something a little bit more rigorous and make that available to practitioners. That's important. Just from our own experience, we have secured maybe half a dozen major contracts in the last 12 months. Every single one of those contracts looks more like an investment proposal than a traditional, I'm going to improve your organization, or I'm going to improve your people in some way. And at the heart of it lies this notion of mental toughness, because we know that mental toughness isn't the outcome that people want. People are interested in other outcomes like output, well-being, ambition, and so on, aspirations, flexibility, agility. But in order to achieve those outcomes, you need to develop an enabler. And that's something that people will often forget. That enabler is mental toughness. Mental toughness is the enabler that allows you to get to some of these outcomes that most people are interested in. And what we know is that if you don't develop that enabler, you're not going to get the outcome that you want. And so to be able to not only measure the outcome, but measure the enabler to show that there's a causal relationship is critical. And a lot of our clients, especially the bigger, better educated clients, are beginning to understand that. And that's what I mean by the last half a dozen proposals have been much more like investment proposals, where we've had to show how we would impact on something that's important to the client and why we think it would impact and how we would evidence that. So, where can you access the program? Well, in Australia and in the I suppose in a Pacific region, the two most important partners we have are Mental Toughness Partners and the Positivity Institute. And so you can access those the programs through those two partners, and the contact information is there on the screen. There is also going to be a facility to upgrade people who have attended a tutor-led program. One of the features of the online programs or online-based programs is that the online material is available to people who've completed the program forever, or certainly for a long while until some major change occurs. And upgrades are available to that person, which means that they can go back to that material in an upgraded format many, many times. There will be an upgrade capability, and there will be a fee for that, but it'll be a nominal fee for people who've only attended tutor-led programs, so that they can then have access to these materials. So that's taking about 25 minutes. It's taken a lot longer than I intended to, but if you have any questions, please, we're quite happy to answer them. If you've got questions after the webinar, please address them to either Dr. Susie Green or to Paul Lyons, and you have their email addresses there. So I'm going to stop talking now and take it back to Susie and Paul.
Thanks, Doug. And without really knowing the backgrounds of people that are on the call today, I guess I'm a bit curious that there might be people that are quite new to mental toughness and the licensed user training. Would you be able to just speak briefly to who the LUT, we call it, licensed user training, is ideal for? Like, who are the people that are looking to complete that you find?
Well, there are two. Okay, so the first thing to understand is why mental toughness is different from a lot of other psychological models. And the critical difference, a big difference, is almost everybody these days is aware of personality, and they've come in contact with personality measures. But I would guarantee that 99.9% of those measures and those concepts have been behavioral models. So the essence is they assess how we act when things happen. And that's quite useful to know, but it's not really the most useful or the most important question from a practitioner's point of view or from a client's point of view. What we want to understand is why people acted the way they do. And you can't look at how they act and go back and assess why they act the way they do. You can speculate it, but there are so many factors behind, say, performance or well-being, it's impossible to say this is the factor that led to this outcome. However, the mental toughness concept is measuring something at a slightly more fundamental level. It's measuring, or it's describing and assessing how we think when things happen. And the importance of research is that the research shows that how we think influences to a significant degree how we behave. So it's not the whole of the explanation, but it's a big part of the explanation. And so to be able to take your practice or your understanding of what's going on to another level, understanding the mental toughness concept is really a big breakthrough. So it's without sort of going into the mental toughness development program itself, it's a very old concept. If you go back all the way to Plato, Plato talks about fortitude. It's exactly the same idea. And for thousands of years, we've known that mindset or attitude or mental toughness, however you want to describe it, is important. It's a determining factor. We've never been able to understand it fully or sufficiently well to be able to use it until now. We've never been able to assess it with a reasonable degree of reliability until now, but we can now. So we can add this to our portfolio of tools and techniques and knowledge and understanding and skills. And that's why it's suddenly becoming much more popular. Popular is the wrong word. It's so effective. It's making a real difference for individuals and for organizations. So the program consists, I suppose, of 2 or 3 elements. The first thing is you have to spend a bit of time explaining what mental toughness is, where it's come from, and what the 8 factors are and the 4 constructs are. Because some of the language is very similar to some of the language that you'll find in behavioral models. And we find without that understanding the nuances, people will often misunderstand and misapply. So there's a need to understand the concept and the model to a sufficient degree to be able to then take the next step, which is normally about assessing or understanding individuals. And what that means is using the mental toughness questionnaire, looking at the output from the questionnaire and understanding what that output is telling us. I said before that 20 years ago, even we would be looking at pictures of overall mental toughness and overall mental sensitivity. We now know that's too simple a way of looking at things. What you need to understand is an individual's mental toughness and mental sensitivity across every one of those 8 scales, and then look at the way that that information combines. And so the second bit of the program is understanding how to use the concept, how to use the measure, and how to understand the output. And the final piece is how to share that with the client or the organization effectively. And again, this is touching upon the issue of self-awareness. Self-awareness is a word that we're beginning to come across and use a lot. I might be mentally tough, but if I'm not self-aware about my mental toughness can actually carry the seeds of downsides. I can actually underperform because of my mental toughness. And so what we are understanding, and this is coming back to the notion of the enabler, is yes, we have this quality. We can either be mentally tough or mentally sensitive, but we need to understand our own mental toughness and our own mental sensitivity to learn how to optimize that in all the situations we find ourselves in. And so the licensed user training program really covers those 3 areas. It then touches upon briefly mental toughness. How can you develop mental toughness? An interesting thing about that is that most of the tools and techniques are actually currently known to most people. And so we don't have to spend so much time around that. The most important thing we need to get across in that element of the program is to target your intervention to an accurately assessed need. So that's what the licensed user training program covers. Now, because we've grown our understanding of it to such a degree, I mean, you'll know, Susie, that when we first started, we didn't have 120 research papers. We had maybe 10. We didn't have 8 factors that had to be explained. We basically had 4 constructs. The whole thing has exploded. So there's a lot more to grasp, but our challenge has been to try and retain the accessibility and keep it as simple as possible, whilst at the same time making it as practical as possible.
Yeah. Doug, there's a couple of questions, but before I go from the participants, and I'm sure Paul has a question or 2 as well, I just wanted to reflect because I've used it for years, as you know, and in some organisations where we've put a proposal in to use the tool and to run a workshop on it, there's been the scenario where there hasn't been a budget sufficient to run the tool. So, and I'm aware that other colleagues are using the model as a way to introduce, I guess, and unpack mental toughness or even, resilience. But my experience has been when we ask people to simply reflect and rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10, which is how the mental toughness sits on the bell curve, it's often quite surprising for people if they do then undertake the test, that they often rate themselves a lot higher than what the test, even though it is a self-report test, if you do, answer honestly, you might find that your score is a little lower than what you are self-assessing. So for me, that's one of the important, parts of actually considering the assessment tool itself.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Susie. I mean, we do come across a lot of people who will come on the licensed user training program and then they will just go away and use the concept. But yeah, we've carried out exercises where we've looked at, we've asked groups of coaches to look at a scenario and say, right, what do you think are the factors that are relevant in this scenario? And in some cases, they've got 3/4 have got the wrong diagnosis. Because what we're trying to do with mental toughness is assess something that's going on in somebody's head. It's incredibly difficult to see inside somebody's head. In fact, it's pretty near impossible unless you are really, really skilled and spend a long time with a client in conversation with them to try and explore what's going on. But you have a psychometric measure which is completed in 15 minutes and with maybe an hour or a 2-hour conversation can get to the same result as quickly and more reliably. So it is very, very important. We also are concerned about misdiagnosis. I mean, the first cases we came across were in a school where teachers would routinely diagnose students as either having confidence or not having confidence. And all the reports would only talk about confidence. What we actually know is that there are 3 other factors, 3 other constructs. There's the sense of control, sense of commitment, and sense of challenge. And when we did our analysis on those same students, we found very often the students who'd been identified as having low levels of confidence, actually had high levels of confidence. They had low levels of challenge or low levels of commitment. And so what we've often see is a kind of bias coming into assessment of people in this area when they're not using something like a framework, this framework or a questionnaire. They're basically defaulting to what they know. And lots of people are more familiar with the notion of confidence than they are with any of the other 3 constructs. So you tend to find a lot of discussions suddenly focus on confidence when really the discussions should be focusing on all 4 areas. So the questionnaire is really, really important. And it's one of the reasons why, for a questionnaire of its type and its reliability and validity, it is remarkably inexpensive.
Yeah, absolutely, compared to a lot of other tools on the market.
Yeah.
Doug, Emily has asked, is there a training document, and I'm fairly sure there is at least some PowerPoints from my memory recall, for practitioners that provide the interplay interpretations that were supplied in the videos in the training program?
Well, there is, within the program, within the new license user program, there is some scenarios that show interplay within constructs and a couple of examples of interplay between constructs. And we, realistically, we can't go much further than that, because if you look at 8 factors, there are up to 40,000 combinations of scores or profiles. So to be able to cover 40,000 different combinations in a program would be impossible. So we tend to stick to the main ones, to the main combinations, and then the rest has to come through practice and through, hopefully, a good understanding of how to build this information about the connections.
Would that be in the training manual then, Doug? Is that right?
Well, I mean, Tony will be able to say it's now built into the online training program. Right. So that it's now built into the materials. That's right, isn't it, Tony?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and we can always share bits of information. Emily, I think you're already a licensed user by the sounds of things, so we can send you some documents and stuff like that to help you kind of understand that interplay and interpretation. So you can reach out to them.
Yeah, fantastic. And another question from Trent asking the timing for the establishment of the Global Practitioner Network, which I think absolutely agree it's much needed. And I was going to ask that same question. What's our timing around that?
Okay, well, that's something for Tony, Claudine and I to work out, but I think we've put our effort into getting the licensed user training program off the ground. It's been launched. It's the next thing on our agenda. I don't know, we might hopefully look at getting something like this running, well, by the end of the year, Tony?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, there's something like this already exists. There are networks of people who kind of communicate with each other, but we want to try and add a bit of structure to it and embrace as many people as we possibly can. So there's a little bit of work to be able to get that in place, but it's not. It's very high on our agenda.
Fantastic. Paul, did you have a question or two?
Just one really, Doug. Thank you for that as well. That was every time I listen to you, I learn several things, and I was just interested about the effect of COVID on, well, I guess on mental toughness. People who perhaps are mentally tough or mentally sensitive. What's been the effect of COVID on those people?
Well, it's really complex, but Peter Clough has been doing some work at Huddersfield by they've been using the mental toughness questionnaire on people over the duration of the COVID-19 experience. And as expected, what we're finding is that in general, and we have to use this phrase in general, that the mentally tough are dealing effectively with the situation they find themselves in, and there may even be some evidence that they're becoming more mentally tough. They're learning how to cope with it and learning, being developing their mental toughness. The mentally sensitive, as you might expect, are not dealing as well. They're the people who are more likely to develop mental health problems. They're more likely to stay at home and won't leave the house and so on. So yes, there is an impact, but it's the interesting thing is that's in general, and that's looking at overall mental toughness and overall mental sensitivity. But as you'll have seen in previous webinars, drilling down to the factor level has also been revealing. So we found, for instance, senior leaders in organizations who generally overall are more mentally tough than average have found themselves suddenly floundering quite often because of a factor. And it might be emotional control suddenly being significant. It might be learning orientation being significant. And so there's I suppose the thing that's is an added dimension here is the sustained nature of the so-called crisis. I think business leaders, and I can remember when I was working for Castrol, when we used to have crises, they'd be over in a week. They never sort of lasted much longer than that. They certainly didn't last a month. They certainly didn't last 6 months. But what we're seeing is our ability to deal with sustained crisis and perhaps not being able to see an end to it is having an interesting impact on people as well. And I think that's going to have some long-term consequences, even when the pandemic lifts, because we're going to find large sections of the population who have kind of been beaten by what's going on, and they won't be in the most positive state of mind. They won't be able to respond to the emergence of a better environment as well as other people. But we'll need it. We'll need it because at the end of the day, our ability to prosper as people also depends on our ability to create things, to create wealth in the wider sense of the word. So we need everybody to sort of get into rebuilding the world so that we can prosper. And if a large number of people are going to be in not the right state of mind to be able to do that, that's going to be a harder slog. And we've seen that in the past.
Doug, I know we haven't got a lot of time left, but I guess I have been, hearing the question from leaders of organisations, I guess, questioning now, should we be, you know, in terms of recruitment for new people coming in, should we be screening for mental toughness? And I guess what you're suggesting, and I have concerns about that personally, but I guess what you're suggesting now that we're learning more about it, it's not just a matter of the, you know, the overall mental toughness, that it might be certain subscales that you might be looking to perhaps have a higher score on. But I guess my concern is too that we might be screening out people that it could be developed, which we know, you know, that it can be developed as well. So what would you say to that?
Well, you're absolutely right, and I understand your concern because we share it. In that mental toughness, we know is a plastic aspect of personality, so it's capable of being developed. So we would say that there may be circumstances where screening is useful. So, for instance, in the UK, when they established the highways officers, these were in the old days when there was an accident on a motorway, the police would have to go and sort it out. And they decided that wasn't a good use of police time. They could create a special category of person, which is called the highways officer, and it would be their job to go to an accident and clear that up. And when you think about it, their job is to get the traffic going again. So the sort of bodies lying around and there's been some gruesome consequences of an accident, it's their job to deal with it. That requires a degree of, I would say, mental toughness and resilience. And when they set it, when they decided to recruit, and I can't remember, they recruited something like 4,000 to 5,000 highways officers, they used the mental toughness questionnaire as a screening tool. But what they did, or what we made them do at the outset, was do a little exercise to go and test officers that they had who were coping well with the job. So if you can evidence the reason for using it as a screening tool, you can probably reliably use it as a screening tool. But you're absolutely right. In most circumstances, what you're doing is generating some information about the individual. It's one piece of information in a selection decision, and it's a piece of information that can be changed. So if, you know, we do find an increasing number of people are beginning to look at the application of the mental toughness concept in recruitment. And it does work very well. It does provide some very useful information about the individual. But, you know, the recruitment process is often a process that has this strange dividing line. You assess people for their fit with the organisation, then bring them on board and not do anything with that information. You already have that information about an individual. Well, with mental toughness, you can get a picture of that person's attitude, their mindset, and so on. That's very useful. You know, if we look at people who've got skills and knowledge, you can have people who've got skills and knowledge, but approach their work with a poor attitude or with the wrong sort of approach, or don't deal well with the particular stressors that would be associated with that job. So the fact that they're highly skilled or very knowledgeable might not enable them to be a terribly good employee. But it's one part of the decision. It should never be the deciding factor in the decision, because, as you and I know, you can develop it. You can do something about it. And moreover, even if you can't develop it, it's that you come back to this question of self-awareness, which is why we keep going on about it. You make somebody self-aware about the reason why other people don't see them as an effective employee. You have a starting point for doing something about it. You don't have to change the individual. You have to change the way that they're responding. So,
well, thanks, Doug.
Susie, Paul, I'm just thinking, I'm a bit conscious that we might have a mix of people who are already licensed users and people that it might be something that's new to them. We have only got a couple of minutes left, I think, but do you want me to just kind of run through some of the practicalities, things like timings and like the program, that kind of stuff, while we've got a little bit of time for that?
I think so, Tony. Unless you've got any other questions, Susie, that people need to ask or want to ask.
No, I'm mindful of time as well. So, but if you had a brief, yeah, if you think any information is helpful.
Go for it, Tony.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pop some slides up that will help.
Thank you.
Just to take a minute, really, just to. Okay. So in terms of the program length, the program is 22 modules long, so it's broken down into different modules for you. You can complete them in your own time, at your own pace. The modules then total up to about 11 hours worth of content, plus exercises and activities. At the end of the program, you're provided with 2 meters or 2 assessments that you can use to practice, so you have a chance to experience the measure full through, from administrating right through to giving feedback, and we can support you through that journey. The modules that the program's made up of, there's 22, so it's everything from what is mental toughness and what mental toughness isn't, the breakdown of the model, so the 4 C's, the 8 factors, right through to evidence for mental toughness, how it fits with other concepts and other ideas, so things like resilience and grit, that kind of stuff, how it all interlinks and relates to each other, right through to applications and handling feedback, that kind of stuff. If you've already completed the program before, if I just flick on, depending on when you completed, you might have only been trained on kind of a 6-factor model. So as Doug was explaining, you know, we've done this research over the years to expand the model, and we're continuing on that kind of journey of development. So the new program now includes the full 8 factors, so right through the real detailed profiles that you get there. With this new program as well, for those that are already licensed users, the difference is that we are trying to enhance the opportunity to practice and for support. So rather than just completing the program and then you'll use the meters on your own, there's a bit more of an element of support here, so we can help you in terms of checking your understanding, make sure that you really have grasped the concept and are confident in using that concept and the questionnaire moving forward. We've got a couple of different formats available, so online, blended, they're all kind of different things that we're exploring, but they're the kind of key practicalities that I was thinking that some people might maybe have some questions around.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. I think there's a question from Karen Steen to yourself. I don't know whether you can see that in the chat box.
Yeah, let's have a little look.
You can answer that one very quickly before we wrap up.
So Karen's question is, what is the additional requirement for those already trained with the 8-factor model? So if you've already trained with the 8 factors, so you're fully, you've got your training on all the different factors available, so the 4 C's and those 8 factors included. What we've done is we've just enhanced it, so you get kind of more detail in the program. We've updated things like evidence, research, that kind of thing. If you've already completed the 8-factor training, then you're okay to go off and use the measure as you need to. I
think you're on mute, actually, Tony. So.
Tony, you've gone mute.
And I think, sadly, we're probably running out of time. So I think we'll draw it to a close. Doug Strycharczyk, thank you very much indeed. That was just a fantastic introduction to the new licensed user training and many, many other things. It was really informative, and so we really appreciate that. Tony Molyneux, thank you very much indeed. Dr. Susie Green, thank you. And to everybody, we really appreciate your attendance and your attention and the questions you've asked. If you've got any questions or you would like to undertake the licensed user training, please either contact Dr. Susie Green or myself. We'd be very pleased to answer any questions or obviously help as well. And thank you again. Thanks, Doug. That was fabulous. And good evening to everybody who's in Australia, and enjoy the rest of the day. for everyone who's got the day to look forward to.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Paul. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.